Hello folks, in this tutorial we're going to be looking at the render queue as a method for exporting your work in Adobe After Effects. Now, as I covered in the tutorial before this, when it comes to getting work out of After Effects, probably the two preferred methods are to use the dynamic link to send it to Premiere, and then of course probably the most important option is to use the Adobe Media Encoder. Now if we just go to composition, and I'm just going to make sure I've selected the timeline. Yeah, just go to composition up here. You've got the add to Adobe Media Encoder queue here, and that's probably the best method for getting your work out. You've got a wonderful variety of options in there, exporting to the web, iPad, phones, you name it. However, there is this option which is add to the render queue. And to be honest, probably the best way to explain why you might choose this option is to dive in and run through it. So let's get started. I'm going to go to add to render queue, and before I do, actually a couple of things I'd like to note. My project is called Rendering Proj. My composition is called Fractal and Tritone. That's going to be quite important, so just park those in the back of your mind while we go through the work. So we're going to go to composition and then add to render queue. It's quite a small panel that pops up, so I'm going to just hit the tilde key just to give it a little bit more size and scope. Now it doesn't look like much, but there's a lot in here. So what I'm probably going to do first of all is click on this yellow text, and this is our output to. This is going to dictate where we want the exported work to go to. So I'm going to click on that, and just for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to set the desktop. And then I'm going to go to save. Now under this drop-down menu, you've got a number of options about how the project can be labelled. I'm not going to let sort of time run away with this by going through all of them, but you can call it the project and comp name. So as an example, if I click on that, it's now the rendering project and the fractal and tritone composition. My preferred one though is this one here, which is comp name and dimensions. So it tells us that the name of the composition I'm knocking out is fractal and tritone, and it's going to be a pretty large size file, 1920 by 1080. If you're sending work out to clients and you're doing multiple different versions of work, and particularly different sizes, that's a useful option to go for. So I'm going to leave it on that. Our render settings can be expanded here, but as you can see, you can't really click on any of it. It just tells us what the render is, in this case, a full resolution at 1920 by 1080. And again, the drop-down menu here isn't an enormous amount of help. The thing you really need to do, and I'm just going to expand that back up, is go into best settings here and create the template for what you want to export. Now the quality is at best. If you put it down to draft or wireframe, that will take the quality down enormously. As you can see, the size is still 1920 by 1080, but it'll be a very low quality render. But if you're in a hurry, you want a small file, maybe to show to a client, to give them an idea of what your post-production work looks like, you can go for a draft or wireframe, but I'm going to leave it on best for the time being. The resolution's on full. Again, that can be dropped down to say 1/4, and you can see here it affects the size of the file again, or rather in this case, the size of the image. But I'm going to put it back to full. Now under here we've got a range of other options as well. Now proxies you may not have heard of, but essentially probably the best way to explain what a proxy is, let me give you a real world example of a project. Let's say you were working on a piece of 3D work and you had a camera moving around in 3D space. And as it moves around in space, it's looking at lots of different video layers. Let's say each layer is 10 to 15 seconds long. Now that's a very big render. If you wanted to give the client an idea of what your 3D camera moves in space might be, you might replace those video files with what's known as a proxy. And a proxy might be one still image of that video file. So the client can have a look at the animation or video work that you've done by just looking at the proxy, which might be a still image to represent the video that will come later. And they're very useful for speeding up renders. You might want to say, yep, use all proxies, don't use the videos on the export. So probably what you're getting a sense of is that this render settings is often used to send out versions of projects that might be an idea of what the client's going to get, but not the full version. Because some of these renders, as we know with After Effects, can be pretty hefty when there's a lot of layers in there, lights, 3D effects, you name it. So you could use proxies to actually replace things so the client gets an idea of what you're doing and you can render it out fast. But in this case, we're just going to say use no proxies. You can do a similar thing for effects as well. You might say, right, all the effects are switched off so the client can see. I've got to be honest, I'm not too sure about this option, because if you switched all the effects off, the client would get very little idea of what you're working on. But again, if the work involved movement, and it's the movement the client wanted to see, not the effects, you could switch all the effects off. Again, then the file size is very easy to render out. You get the idea. And to be honest, as you go through these, you're probably getting a sense that you can switch a lot of things on and off. Let's say, for example, you were working on 10 or 15 video layers. You had 2 of them soloed. You now went to export and you'd forgotten that you had them soloed. You could turn all the solos off. But again, I'm going to put it to current settings. If you've got guides, again, you might have windows, guides, grids up. They can all be, switched off or just left back on again. I'm going to put them all to off. Solos, I'm going to put all off. Effects, I'm going to leave all on. And again, you can do the same thing for color depth. You can have different sizes, 8-bit, 16, 32, depending on what you want to show the client and the quality of what you want to give them. And again, it's a similar thing down here as well. You can have frame blending if you wish. Again, you can have it off for all layers or on. I'm going to leave it on. Field render, well, again, it depends whether you've shot progressive or interlaced footage. The footage I've got is progressive, so I'm going to leave that as off. Motion blur, again, if you've got that switched on, it will turn it on or off. Again, it can save space for the render. And of course, you can have the work area only or the entire length of the composition. Or, if you want to be very precise, you can go in here and actually dictate to the closest frame an exact export time. And of course, you can change the comp's frame rate. Mine was at 25, I'm going to leave it, but you can change it here if you wish. So I suppose the best thing to really point out is that the render, or rather the add to render queue, is really if you want to sort of send out slightly truncated or cut down versions of your work so the client can see it, but you might not have wasted hours and hours of rendering out very heavy effects only for them to change their mind later on. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to leave it on best, resolution on full, and to be honest folks, you can leave most of these. 9 times out of 10, you won't need to touch them. Right, let's click on OK. Now, also, when it comes to the output, again, you've got a range of options here. And some of you may have noticed that our old friend H.264, which is probably the most popular and well-respected method of outputting at the moment, that actually is gone. And we're going to go into here, because actually it's in here where you can actually check your output module in a little bit more depth and a bit more flexibility. So let's go in here and let's see if we can sort out that issue about the format. Now, because this is a Mac, it's defaulted to QuickTime. If you're working on a PC, it would have defaulted to AVI. So let's go in and see if we can locate our H.264. And as we go in, on the new version of After Effects, it's gone. Now, if you want to get it back, I'm just going to come out of here. If you want to get H.264 back, you can go to After Effects, Preferences, and Output. Now, this little tab here, if you click on it, that will put back the option to output at H.264. But a little warning comes up, and the warning says, look, at the end of the day, you shouldn't be really using the After Effects render queue to output things at H.264. As you can see here, the advice it says is use the Adobe Media Encoder. And of course, I do agree with that. But if you do want to go through the render queue and have the option of H.264, go to your output here and tick that on. If I now click on OK, go back here to my output module settings, if I now drop down this menu, H.264 has come back. So I'm going to select that. But I've got to sort of warn you folks, if you do select that, you are sending out a very large, full-size export from After Effects. If you want to use different file sizes for the web, iPad, phone, really export using the Adobe Media Encoder. You've got an option here to resize if you wish. I don't in this case. And you've got options to crop. And again, this should highlight to you that the render queue is used to maybe highlight certain portions of something for a client. It may be there's a specific thing you want them to look at in your work, so you could crop your work down so they look at that bit only. But I'm going to deselect that and deselect that. You've also got audio options here. 32 or 48 are often the most popular. But let's go into the format. So we've got 8.264. We've gone for that. And we then go into format here. And I'm going to leave the profile high, the level at 5.1. So it's going to be a big file. I'm going to go for a variable bitrate because it's something that might have a range of different effects and colors changing often from frame to frame. So variable bitrate is often the best one to go for. But I'm going to go for a target bitrate of 3 and a maximum of 8. If you're going to put something maybe up on YouTube, Vimeo or the web, target of 3, maximum of 8 is about right. Whoops, that's far too high, sorry. Put that back to 8 again. The keyframe distance, I'm going to put it back to 25 because my project does run at 25 frames per second. And what that'll do is that'll set a keyframe holder every 25 frames. Now it's not keyframes in terms of keyframes as animation, it's keyframes, and these are, as you can see, it's two separate words, key and frame, rather than keyframe, which is an animation property. If you want to understand this a little bit more, go into my exporting tutorial in my Premiere playlist. But these keyframes are not animated keyframes that we put on the timeline. They're electronic pieces of information that help the encoding process. And because my project was actually running at 25 frames a second, I'm going to put that to 25. It just helps stabilize the render. If you want to know more about these keyframes here and what this actually means and how it might be different from keyframes you put in the timeline, do have a look at the Adobe Help file. It does explain it in a little bit more depth. But suffice it to say, this section here puts an electronic sort of holder every 25 frames and helps the changes in color, animation and motion from second to second. Right, I'm happy with those options. I'm going to click on OK and click on OK again. I'm going to put the tilde key on one more time just to close that down. And when you're ready to export, and on this occasion I'm going to just take it down to about 1 second just to speed up the process. So I'm going to go to render queue, and when you're ready to do the export, you hit render here, and it'll work its way through the timeline. And that's pretty much it, folks. I'm going to leave that sort of running in the background. But the truth of the matter is, just to sort of reiterate what I said at the start, the render queue really is for sending out truncated, smaller form, maybe lower quality, or adapted versions of work in a fairly quick manner so the client can see what you're working on. If you want to send work out that's got a lot more options, you know, iPad, iPhones, TV, web, please use the Adobe Encoder. Okay, folks, thanks for listening. See you in the next tutorial.